The one moment in your life when you are supposed to feel the most loved, the most held, is the moment you are pushing a human being into the world. I was doing exactly that, sweating, shaking, gripping the rails of that hospital bed with everything I had. And my husband, the man worth $300 million, was standing in the corner of that room, on his phone, sighing like I was inconveniencing him. That was the moment I stopped loving him and the moment I started planning. If you have ever been made to feel small by someone who was supposed to make you feel safe, stay with me until the very end of this story, because what I did next, nobody saw coming. Not him, not his lawyers, not even me at first. If this story hits something inside you, hit that like button right now. And if you're new here, subscribe, because we tell the kind of stories on this channel that people usually only whisper about. Now let me take you back to the beginning. I want you to picture me at 26, not rich, not struggling either, just building. I had a small apartment with good light and drafting paper spread across my kitchen table at midnight. I was an architectural designer, still early in my career, but good at it, really good. My professor said I had an instinct for space, for understanding how a room could make a person feel without them even realizing why. I loved that work, the way you love something that chose you back. I was not looking for a man. I was not looking for a rescue. I was looking at floor plans and elevation sketches and wondering if I could one day design a building that made strangers stop walking and just look up. Richard came into my life as a client. He owned land, a lot of it. Cattle ranches, agricultural estates, rural properties across 3 states. Old money that had been compounding for 2 generations. He was 51 to my 26, and he walked into our first meeting like the room had been waiting for him. Confident in a way that isn't performance, it's just ownership. He owned everything he stood near. He wanted me to redesign the main lodge on his largest ranch. A project. That's all it was supposed to be. But he started calling outside of meetings, asking my opinion on things that had nothing to do with the lodge, then asking my opinion on things that had nothing to do with work at all. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced before, not just as a designer, but as a woman with thoughts worth pursuing. I was 26, and I mistook intensity for intimacy. I hesitated when he asked me to dinner. I remember that hesitation clearly, even now. Something in me paused. That pause was instinct. That pause was the only truly smart thing I did in the 3 years that followed, and I talked myself out of listening to it. We were married 14 months after that first dinner. The first year was real enough that I don't want to rewrite it. He was attentive. He took me to places I had never been. He introduced me to people who moved the world quietly from rooms most people never enter. I felt elevated. I won't pretend otherwise. But elevation, I learned slowly, has a cost. And the cost was me. It started with suggestions. You don't need to take that project. You're exhausted. Why work weekends when you don't have to? A woman in your position, my wife, it looks strange, Natalie, like I can't provide. The comments were soft at first, wrapped in care. By the time I recognized them as a cage, the door had already been closing for 2 years. I stopped working, fully. I told myself it was temporary, a pause. I would go back when things settled. But things with Richard never settled. They just reorganized around his schedule, his needs, his world. I went from being a woman with a drafting table and a vision to being a woman who picked the flowers for the centerpieces at dinner parties she didn't want to host. I had a driver. I had a housekeeper. I had a closet full of clothes that cost more than my first year's salary. And I was lonelier than I had ever been in that small apartment with the good light. Because loneliness inside a marriage is a different kind of loneliness. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. From the outside, it looks like a life people dream of. When I found out I was pregnant, something in me exhaled for the first time in years. I remember sitting on the bathroom floor holding that test and feeling not scared, not strategic, just quietly full, like something true had found its way back into my life. A baby, someone who would be mine in a way nothing else in that house was mine. I began to rebuild my inner world around that pregnancy. I read. I sketched again, just for myself, just small things, nothing anyone would see. I started talking to my daughter through my stomach before I even knew she was a daughter. I told her about the apartment with the good light. I told her about the drafting paper. I told her that her mother used to be someone. I was still telling her that story when the contractions started. Labor began on a Tuesday morning in October. Not dramatic, just a slow, building certainty that today was the day. I called Richard at 8 in the morning. He was at a ranch management meeting 2 hours away. He said he'd wrap up and come. That was the first thing. Wrap up, not drop everything. Wrap up. He arrived at the hospital 3 hours later. Not rushed. His tie was still straight. He kissed my forehead the way you kiss a relative you're not close to, and asked the nurse how long it would be, like he was asking about a delayed flight. I should tell you about his mother, Margaret. Richard had called her, without asking me, without mentioning it beforehand, and she arrived 30 minutes after he did. Margaret was the kind of woman who had never needed to be cruel out loud because her tone did the work for her. She sat in the chair in the corner of my delivery room like it was a theater seat, and she was waiting for a show she hadn't paid much for. The hours passed. If you've been through labor, you know what those hours are. They are not cinematic. They are not clean. They are the most physical, animal, demanding thing a human body can do. I was loud. I couldn't help it. Each contraction hit like a wave I couldn't stand up inside. And Richard, my husband, looked at me at one point and said, "Can you try to keep it down? You're going to exhaust yourself." I looked at him. I genuinely looked at him, and I thought, he actually believes that. He actually thinks this is a volume problem. Margaret didn't say anything. She just made a small sound, not quite a word, just a breath shaped like agreement. A nurse adjusted something on the monitor near my bed. A small woman, older, maybe 60, with short gray hair and the hands of someone who had been in rooms like this for decades. She didn't look at Richard or Margaret. She looked at me. And for just a second, she held my gaze in a way that said, "I see what's happening here. I see you." I held on to that look like a rope. The pushing stage came, and Richard stepped into the hallway to take a phone call. I want you to understand that. Not to go get water, not to compose himself. A phone call. He came back in time for the final minutes, I'll give him that. And when our daughter arrived, red and screaming and absolutely perfect, I felt the kind of joy that doesn't have a name. I held her to my chest and I closed my eyes, and for about 45 seconds the room didn't exist. Just her weight, just her voice, just this. Then I heard Richard's voice and the 45 seconds ended. He was looking at her, his daughter, freshly born, still minutes old, and his face was doing something I hadn't expected. It was falling. Not in grief, not in overwhelm, just in a quiet, private disappointment he didn't even bother to hide. And then he said it, out loud, in front of the nurse, in front of Margaret, in front of me holding my newborn daughter who would one day be old enough to hear this story. He said, "Well, we'll have to try again once you're recovered." Not, "She's beautiful," not, "You were incredible," not, "I love you, I love her, thank you, I'm here." "We'll have to try again." I didn't cry in that moment. I went very, very still, like the way water goes still right before it freezes. Margaret gave a small approving nod, like he had said something sensible, like we were discussing livestock production and the yield had been disappointing. The doctor finished her work. Richard and Margaret stepped out together, already talking about something else, something I wasn't part of. And then it was just me and my daughter and the nurse with the short gray hair. She came to my bedside. She checked something on the monitor, and then, quietly, without making it a moment or a speech, she reached down and covered my hand with hers, just held it. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. That touch said, "What happened here was not okay, and you are not invisible, and I see you." I broke open. Not from pain, the physical pain I could manage. I broke open from clarity. Because in that moment, holding my daughter with a stranger's hand over mine, I finally saw my marriage for exactly what it was. Not a partnership, not even a failure, a purchase. He had purchased a lifestyle that included a wife, and the wife had not delivered the correct product, and now he was planning the next order. I looked at my daughter's face. She was asleep already, the way newborns sleep, completely, trustingly, with no idea what world she had arrived in. I made her a promise, 2 sentences, quiet enough that only she could hear. I said, "I will not let him do to you what he did to me, and I am going to make sure you grow up watching your mother choose herself." That was the beginning of the end. Not of me, of him. Coming home from the hospital felt like being returned to a scene I no longer belonged in. The house was perfect, fresh flowers in the foyer, the nursery staged like a magazine photo. Beautiful, empty, the kind of beautiful that has nothing to do with warmth. Richard hired a night nurse without asking me. He said it was so I could recover. What it actually meant was that even the 3 a.m. seating, the one sacred, exhausted, half-asleep moment that is entirely yours as a new mother, was taken from me and managed, because that's what Richard did. He managed things, including me. But something had shifted. I was different in a way he couldn't see yet. Quiet looks the same from the outside, whether it's defeat or strategy. Richard assumed mine was defeat. That was his first mistake. I started paying attention, slowly, methodically, the way I used to study a building before I redesigned it. You walk through it, you note what's load-bearing, what's cosmetic, what's been hidden behind a wall that someone didn't want you to find. I started walking through my marriage the same way. I looked at documents I had been too disinterested, too beaten down to read before. I found files in the home office I had always been subtly discouraged from entering. Property deeds, trust arrangements, business structures with names I didn't recognize. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough to know that there was a great deal Richard had never felt the need to explain to me because he had never believed I would think to ask. His arrogance was a filing system, and I had just started reading it. 6 weeks after coming home, I picked up the phone and called the one person I had quietly missed for years, Professor Ruth, my architecture professor from graduate school, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, who had told me when I was 23 that I had the instincts of a great designer, and that I should never let anyone talk me into making myself smaller to fit inside their idea of what a woman should be. I hadn't listened, but I was listening now. I didn't tell her everything. I just asked her one question. I said, "Ruth, if someone wanted to come back, really come back, start from scratch, where would they begin?" She didn't ask why. She didn't ask what happened to the marriage or where I'd been all these years. She just said they'd begin with one project, the right one, the kind that reminds them who they are before they worry about anything else. That was enough. I started working at night. After Richard had gone to bed, after the house went quiet, I would sit at a small desk in the corner of the dressing room, not even a real desk, just a surface, and I would work. I rebuilt my portfolio from nothing. I reached out to old contacts carefully, quietly, in ways that didn't run through any shared account or device. I used an old laptop I had kept from before the marriage, sitting in a box in the back of a closet like a thing I had been too sad to throw away, but too afraid to use. Nobody knew. Not Richard, not the housekeeper, not the one friend I still had from my old life. Not even Ruth knew the full picture yet. For 6 months, I lived 2 lives inside the same house. In the daylight, I was Richard's wife, composed, present at dinners, asking appropriate questions about the cattle markets and the land negotiations. At night, I was Natalie Hale again, my maiden name, the one I had quietly, legally kept on 2 pieces of identification that Richard had never thought to check. The name I was now signing on emails, the name I was bringing back to life. I want to be honest about those 6 months. They were not clean or triumphant. There were nights I sat at that small desk and felt the full weight of 7 years. 7 years of shrinking, of silencing myself, of watching my instincts get buried under someone else's certainty. There were nights I looked at my daughter sleeping and felt terrified. Terrified of what leaving would cost, of whether I could actually do this, of whether I had waited too long and become someone who could no longer find their way back to themselves. But then I would open the laptop, and I would work, and the work reminded me, every single time, that she was still there. The woman who understood space and structure and how to make something beautiful and load-bearing at the same time. She had gone nowhere. She had just been waiting in a dark closet, like an old laptop nobody thought to check. The commission came on a Thursday morning. An email from a boutique hotel group looking to redesign a property 3 states away, a historic building with complicated bones that 3 other designers had turned down. They had found my name through a former colleague who had quietly recommended me. The budget was real, the timeline was real, the creative freedom was real. I read that email 4 times. Then I replied with my rate, a rate I had set not from desperation but from value, and signed it with my full maiden name. They responded within 2 hours. I sat in the dressing room with the door closed, my hand over my mouth, my daughter asleep in the next room, and I allowed myself 30 seconds of something that wasn't strategy, just feeling. Just the overwhelming, almost painful sensation of being chosen, professionally, deliberately chosen after years of being reduced. 30 seconds. Then I closed the laptop and went back to the rest of the plan. I had found the attorney through Ruth, a woman named Caroline who specialized in high-asset divorce and who came with a reputation that made Richard's kind of money nervous. I met her in her office, not mine, not anywhere connected to my life with Richard. I brought everything I had found, printed, organized, cross-referenced the way an architect organizes drawings. She looked through it for 40 minutes while I sat across from her and barely breathed. Then she looked up and told me 3 things about my own marriage contract that I had not known, things buried in language I had signed at 27 without independent legal counsel, a fact she noted with a very particular tone. She told me that certain assets held in a family trust, assets Richard had structured in a way he believed made them untouchable, were not, in her assessment, untouchable. Not with the evidence I had, not with the right arguments in front of the right judge. She said, he was thorough, but he wasn't thorough enough because he assumed you weren't paying attention. I said, I know. He told me that himself, without using those words. She smiled and told me to come back in 2 weeks. The morning I told Richard, and I chose the morning deliberately, the specific ordinary Tuesday morning quality of it, because I wanted it to be unremarkable on his end until it wasn't, I was calm. I mean that. It was not performed calm. I had been performing calm for 7 years. This was different. This was the calm of someone who had already done the hard thing and was now simply completing a step. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a newspaper, which was a habit so old and unchanged it almost made me feel something. Almost. I placed the envelope in front of him the way you place a finished project on someone's desk, clearly, without drama. He looked at it, then at me, then he laughed, actually laughed, a short dismissive sound that I recognized from years of any idea he hadn't originated himself. He said, Natalie, what is this? I said, it's exactly what it looks like. He opened it, read the first page, and I watched something move through his face in sequence, amusement, then confusion, then the beginning of something colder. He looked up and said with the full weight of $300 million behind his voice, you think you'll get anything? You have nothing. And I said simply and without heat, enough. That word. I had been practicing it for 6 months in that dressing room at midnight, and I had promised myself that when the moment came, I would give him exactly one word and not a syllable more, because every syllable beyond that was something he didn't deserve, and I was done giving things to people who didn't deserve them. What followed was 8 months of what I can only describe as him trying to use money as a language in a conversation where I had already stopped speaking that language. He threatened, he delayed, he had 3 attorneys and 2 financial investigators and 1 private detective who spent 6 weeks watching me do nothing more interesting than take my daughter to the park and work late in a studio he didn't know I had. His people found nothing because there was nothing to find. I had not cheated, I had not lied on documents, I had simply quietly done my work and let his own paper trail speak at the volume it had always been speaking. He had just assumed no one in his house would ever learn to read it. The settlement took 8 months. It was not everything, it was not nothing. It was, as I had promised him, enough. Enough to open the studio, enough to give my daughter and me a real start, enough to convert all of his years of arrogance into square footage I actually own and work I actually chose.
My studio is small. That was a deliberate choice. I know how to build big. That instinct is still there, but I wanted to start in a space that felt like mine before it felt like an impression. There's a front wall in the entrance with a texture panel I designed myself, and pressed into the plaster in one corner, small enough that most clients don't notice it right away, is a handprint. My daughter's. She was 14 months old when I pressed her hand into the wet plaster. She thought it was funny. She laughed that whole body laugh that toddlers do, the one that seems too large for their size. That handprint is the first thing I see every morning when I walk in. The hotel project was finished last year. I'm not going to tell you it was perfect. The bones of that building fought me for months, and there were weeks I questioned every decision I made. But when I stood inside the finished lobby for the first time, I felt something I had not felt in so long I had almost forgotten it was possible. Pride. Clean, uncomplicated, entirely mine. I heard through people we both know that Richard has remarried. Someone younger, someone who, and I say this without cruelty, only with the full weight of knowing, has not been told to read the marriage contract carefully. I hope she does. I genuinely hope she does. I wrote him a letter after the settlement was signed. I never sent it. I kept it in a folder in my desk drawer for almost a year, and I read it occasionally when I needed to remember exactly how far I had come. It's not an angry letter. Anger had burned through me and was gone. Anger doesn't sustain itself when you're busy building something real. It's not a forgiving letter either. Forgiveness is something I'm working on privately, in my own time, at my own pace, and I don't owe him the performance of it. The last line of that letter says this. I'll share just that line because it's the only one that matters. It says, "The most expensive thing I ever gave you was my indifference, and I finally stopped paying." I am 35 years old. I have a daughter who at 2 years old already points at buildings and says pretty, and at construction sites and says big. I have a studio with her handprint in the wall. I have a project list that is mine. I have a name I chose and kept and signed and built something real with. I am not a woman who was rescued. I want to be clear about that. Nobody came. No one showed up at the right moment to fix it. The nurse held my hand, and that mattered more than she will ever know. But even that was just one human being saying, "You are visible." What happened after that was mine. The late nights were mine. The fear was mine. The decision to stop being afraid was mine. The work was mine. That is the part of the story that doesn't get told enough. Not the villain and not the victory. The part in the middle. The 6 months in the dressing room at midnight. The shaking hands on an old laptop. The moment you choose yourself, not because it's easy or certain, but because the alternative is finishing your life as someone else's footnote. Don't be someone's footnote. If you made it to the end of this story, I want to say something to you directly. You didn't stay because it was comfortable. You stayed because something in it found something in you. Maybe it was the delivery room. Maybe it was the dressing room at midnight. Maybe it was just the feeling of watching someone go quiet in a way that meant danger rather than defeat. Whatever it was, that recognition is yours. Hold on to it. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below and tell me the one moment in this story that hit the hardest. I read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't, because every week we bring you stories like this. True in spirit, human in every detail, and never ever easy. And remember this, the most powerful move you will ever make will not look powerful from the outside. It will look like silence. It will look like patience. It will look like a woman sitting at a small desk at midnight, working, when everyone around her has assumed she has already given up. She hasn't given up. She's just getting started.